Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. We've got a pretty fascinating chapter to explore today.
Oh, absolutely.
You know, you sent over this chapter titled Misfortune of Ego.
Yeah.
From, and this is interesting, the BFG Handbook.
Okay.
Which is, as it's described, a Christian edition of the Tao Te Ching, which right off the bat, I think is, a pretty curious thing.
Yeah, for sure.
To sort of, it sparks your interest. It's like, wait a minute, these two things together.
Right.
It's looking at, this very ancient wisdom about living well and principles of harmony and balance.
Yeah.
But through this very specific lens of the Christian faith.
Yeah.
And that kind of gives us, I think, a really unique angle on ideas that we might already somewhat familiar with.
Yeah, it's a fascinating blend.
Right.
And what struck me about this chapter in particular is its focus on the ego.
Okay.
And, self-centeredness, not just as these sort of abstract philosophical concepts.
Right.
But as real sources of unhappiness and struggle in our lives. And then it contrasts that with, the power of humility and selfless love.
Yeah.
All within a framework that, like you said, really echoes these core Christian teachings.
Yeah, and it goes a step further, right? Because
Yeah.
it actually lays out this framework, this renewal framework. Mindset, aim, practice, respond.
Right.
Which seems like a really practical way to not only understand these ideas, but to actually begin to put them into action in our day-to-day lives.
Yeah, I like that.
So I think that's kind of our mission today in this deep dive, is to really get to the heart of this chapter.
Okay.
What are its key messages?
Yeah.
And how does this renewal framework really sort of guide us on that journey? And I think maybe the best place to start is, right at the beginning.
Okay, sounds good.
Which is with this concept of mindset.
All right, so let's unpack this. The chapter opens with this line that seems almost like a contradiction. Honor and humility can be equally fearful. And then right after that, it hits you with great misfortune is the ego.
Yeah.
It really makes you stop and think.
It does. And then it goes on to explain that, honor can be a source of anxiety.
Right.
Because it's so dependent on, external validation and approval.
Right.
Like you're constantly aware of trying to gain it, and then perhaps even more so trying to hold on to it.
Oh, absolutely.
Like a very fragile position to be in.
Yeah, you're always looking over your shoulder.
Right, exactly. And then it talks about humility.
Okay.
Which maybe surprisingly is also presented as something that we might fear.
Oh, interesting.
And I think, maybe because there's this worry that if we don't sort of assert ourselves,
right,
we might be overlooked, not valued.
Yeah, you become invisible.
Right, exactly.
Like you don't matter.
Yeah. So what do you think is going on there?
Well, it seems like the chapter is suggesting that, whether it's this kind of striving for the spotlight of honor, or this shrinking back from the perceived insignificance of humility, both of those actually keep us focused on, on our own ego and its needs.
Right.
It's almost like that fear of losing honor, that fear of being overlooked. It all comes back to this worry about how we are perceived, not from a place of genuine, inner peace. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think that makes total sense. And it leads right into that next point. Great misfortune is the ego.
Yeah.
It's essentially saying that our attachment to this sense of self, to this ego, is really the root of so much of our suffering. That if we could sort of loosen that grip, misfortune itself would kind of lose its power over us.
Wow.
Pretty profound.
It is profound. And it resonates deeply with, I think, some of the most fundamental Christian teachings, right?
Yep.
I mean, think about Jesus's frequent critiques of the Pharisees,
right?
Which, as the chapter points out, you see this in Matthew 23.27-32.
Okay.
He's condemning their obsession with this outward piety. They're meticulously cleaning the outside of cups and dishes.
Right.
But their insides, he says, are full of greed and self-indulgence.
Yeah.
It's this powerful image, right? They're prioritizing external validation over this true inner transformation. They're so focused on how they appear to others that they're missing the point of the inward humility.
Yeah, and the chapter really, I think, connects that outward focus to a neglect of inner values,
right,
which is something that Jesus, of course, emphasizes over and over again.
Absolutely.
And, it brings in that great verse from Luke 9.23,
Okay.
Deny themselves and take up their cross daily.
Right.
Like, that's such a direct call to move away from this, ego-driven existence.
Yeah, to let go of that self-focus.
Yeah, exactly. And then, you have Colossians 3.3, this concept of our identity hidden with Christ.
Right.
Which, again, really shifts, where our sense of self should even originate from. If our core identity isn't tied to worldly recognition, then, the ups and downs of honor and all the anxieties of the ego, they lose their sting.
Yeah, they lose their grip on us. I mean, it makes you think, right? Like, how often do you find yourself making decisions or feeling anxious because of a desire for recognition or maybe a fear of being undervalued?
Yeah, that's something to really sit with.
It is.
So, moving from this understanding of honor and this impact of the ego, the chapter then goes on to explore another, really important aspect of mindset.
Okay.
And that's how we relate to the world around us.
Interesting.
And it introduces this really compelling idea of valuing and loving the world as if it were our own self.
Okay.
Now, I think it's important, especially within this kind of Christian framework, that we understand what this means, because it's not advocating for self-worship, right?
Right.
Or some kind of self-centered view of the universe. To clarify this, the chapter actually references John 15.9 to 17, where, of course, Jesus commands us to love one another as I have loved you. And that kind of shifts the focus, right?
Yeah.
Away from self-interest and towards extending that kind of selfless, Christ-like love outward, embodying that love in our interactions with the world.
Yeah, so loving the world as your own self, but in this context, it really means selfless service. Right?
Yeah.
It's a genuine and deep care for the well-being of others as if their needs were our own.
Right.
And the chapter even goes on to suggest that, this kind of selfless love is actually the pathway to gaining trust.
Okay.
And ultimately to inheriting the world.
Which, again, is kind of a fascinating contrast to how we usually think about gaining influence or power.
Yeah, right.
Through dominance, competition, self-promotion.
Exactly. Yeah.
But this is saying, no, it's actually this genuine care and love that cultivates this much deeper and lasting form of influence.
Yeah. And I think what's really insightful there is this implicit critique of systems and structures that are built on ego and self-interest. The chapter's proposing a whole different model,
Yeah.
Influence and impact that are earned through selfless love and a sincere concern for the welfare of others.
Yeah.
It's a big shift, from this self-centered way of being to an other-centered way.
Absolutely. So that kind of sets the stage for the whole mindset component of the renewal framework.
Yeah.
And the chapter then nicely summarizes 4 key mindset shifts.
Okay.
What are those?
Well, the first one is developing this understanding of the fear that underlies both the pursuit of honor and the avoidance of humility.
Okay.
Right. Recognizing that both can be rooted in this preoccupation with the self. The second is a clear acknowledgement of the destructive nature of the ego.
Yeah.
And how it directly leads to suffering.
Right.
The third is actively cultivating empathy
by
genuinely valuing others and their needs. And the final shift is developing selfless love for the world, mirroring the selfless love that Christ has for humanity.
Yeah, and to support each of these, it gives some great scriptural references. Like James 4.10 on humbling yourself before the Lord.
Right.
Philippians 2.3 to 4 on considering others as more important than yourselves. Matthew 7.12, the golden rule.
Of course.
And John 13.34 through 5, the new commandment to love one another.
Yeah.
So it really grounds these mindset shifts in some, core Christian teaching.
Yeah, it gives them a solid foundation. And then what I really appreciate is that it provides these real-world application examples for each of these shifts. It helps make these abstract concepts more relatable to daily life.
Okay, give us an example.
Okay, so for the fear of honor and humility, it suggests actively seeking opportunities to serve others without any expectation of praise, right? And finding contentment in your current role, whether it's visible or more behind the scenes.
Yeah.
What about you? What resonates with you most from these initial mindset shifts?
I think for me, it's that connection between the fear of humility and the ego. It's like we often think of them as opposites, but it makes sense that a deep-seated fear of being overlooked could actually come from this, overinflated ego.
Right.
That feels entitled to recognition.
Yeah, it's a subtle but powerful connection.
Okay, so after laying this foundation of mindset, the chapter moves into, aim.
Yeah.
How does it guide us in directing our intentions?
Well, the aim section builds on the mindset.
Okay.
It's about consciously directing our intentions based on these principles, right?
Right.
So the first aim is to actively choose humility over the pursuit of honor. And it actually references Matthew 23.12 here.
Okay.
For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted.
Right.
So it's not just about understanding like the pitfalls of seeking honor.
Yeah.
It's about making this conscious decision to prioritize humility.
So it's a proactive choice, not just like a passive understanding.
Exactly. The second aim is to intentionally strive for freedom from the grip of the ego. And here it brings in Proverbs 16.118. Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall.
Right.
It's about consciously working to let go of that self-centered desire for control and recognition.
And that's, an ongoing internal work, I think.
Oh, for sure.
To really recognize those moments where our ego is trying to, take control.
Absolutely. It's a lifelong practice.
Yeah, exactly.
The third aim is to genuinely value others as we value ourselves. Again, underscoring the principle from Matthew 7, the golden rule.
Right.
It's about making a conscious decision to consider the needs and well-being of others as equally important to our own.
Yeah.
And finally, the aim is to cultivate selfless love and service.
Okay.
This time drawing on John 13.34-35.
Okay.
It's about intentionally directing our motivation towards serving others with that same selfless, sacrificial love that Christ demonstrated. And, just like with the mindset section, it gives practical, real-world application examples for each of these aims as well.
Okay. Like what?
Well, for aiming for humility, it suggests making a conscious effort to perform acts of service without seeking any recognition in return.
Okay.
And for freedom from the ego, it encourages pausing when we feel that sense of pride rising up.
Right.
And consciously choosing a more humble response.
Yeah.
These concrete examples are so valuable for translating these principles into actionable intentions in our daily lives.
I think so too. It really bridges that gap between, understanding the theory and actually implementing it.
Exactly.
So we've covered mindset and aim.
Yeah.
What does the practice component of this renewal framework involve?
Well, practice is where the rubber really meets the road. It's where those principles move from intention to action.
Okay.
The tangible steps we take to actually embody these shifts and these directed aims.
Okay.
The first practice is, again, prioritizing humility over honor.
Yeah.
This time referencing James 4.10.
Okay.
And it gives this really practical suggestion. When praise comes your way, consciously deflect that praise to God.
Right.
Redirect that focus away from yourself.
Yeah, instead of sort of basking in the compliments.
Right. Exactly.
You're intentionally shifting the acknowledgement to a higher power.
Exactly. Then the second practice is about freedom from the ego.
Okay.
And here Luke 9.23 is referenced again, along with the call to surrender our desires.
Yeah.
It's about actively and consciously working to let go of those self-serving impulses.
Which is, like we were saying, a continuous journey.
Oh, absolutely.
A lifelong thing.
A lifelong unfolding, yeah.
Yeah.
The third practice is about cultivating selfless love for others. We love because he first loved us.
Right.
And it encourages actively seeking opportunities to serve those around us.
So it's really about putting love into motion.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Moving beyond just the feeling to actually demonstrating that love.
Yeah.
And then it talks about practicing selfless service to the world.
Okay.
This time referencing Matthew 25.40.
Okay.
Urging us to actively engage in acts of justice and compassion in the wider world. To see our service to others, especially those in need, as service to Christ himself.
Yeah, that's pretty powerful.
It is. It really reframes how we see our actions. And then there's a fifth practice highlighted. Living according to God's will.
Okay.
With a reference to James 1.22.
Okay.
And the reminder that it's not enough to just hear the teachings, but we have to do what they say.
Right. Put them into practice.
Yeah, exactly. Aligning our choices and actions with those principles. And once again, it offers real-world application examples, making it all very tangible. For instance, with selfless love, it suggests looking for small, everyday opportunities to offer help and support.
Yeah, I think those real-world examples are so important because they take these sometimes kind of lofty ideals and ground them in the reality of, our everyday experiences.
Yeah, they show us how to actually live them out.
So we've explored mindset, aim, and practice.
Right.
The final component of this renewal framework is respond.
Okay.
What's the focus there?
Respond is really interesting because it focuses on the transformative outcome of this inner renewal. How this process empowers us to respond more fully to a call to holiness and to engage with the world in a way that transcends those specific cultural or religious boundaries.
Okay.
It's about recognizing this shared human quest for meaning and purpose.
Yeah, and the chapter does this by, drawing some really fascinating parallels.
Oh, yeah.
Between Christian teachings on humility and love and similar concepts in Buddhism, Islam, and Hinduism.
Right.
Let's start with that theme of humility and the dangers of ego.
Okay.
What kind of connections does it highlight there?
Well, in Christianity, it points to Philippians 2.3,
Okay.
which encourages us to consider others better than ourselves.
Yeah.
And then in Buddhism, it brings up the concept of anatta,
Okay.
often translated as non-self, which emphasizes the impermanent nature of what we perceive as our individual self.
So not this fixed ego-driven identity.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
In Islam, it mentions Surah Al-Furqan 25.63, which describes the servants of the Most Merciful as those who walk humbly on the earth
Right.
and respond peacefully even to ignorant behavior.
So again, this emphasis on humility.
Absolutely. And in Hinduism, it highlights the Bhagavad Gita 13.8, which emphasizes humility as a key virtue in the pursuit of knowledge.
Yeah, so it seems like across these different traditions, humility is really valued as a positive quality,
Yeah.
while ego and excessive pride are recognized as these sources of suffering and obstacles to spiritual growth.
It's amazing to see that common thread emerge.
It really is. It's like this idea of moving beyond a self-centered ego.
Yeah.
It seems to be a very fundamental human aspiration. What about teachings on, loving the world and its people?
Well, here the chapter draws parallels between Matthew 22.39 in Christianity, love your neighbor as yourself,
Right.
and John 13.34-35, the Buddhist principle of metta, which is all about cultivating loving kindness and compassion towards all beings. A hadith in Islam that encourages wishing for your brother or sister what you wish for yourself.
Okay.
And the Bhagavad Gita 9.22, which speaks of the Lord providing for those who are devoted and love him in all beings.
So again, that core principle of extending love and service to others.
Right, a consistent theme.
It seems like compassion and empathy really aren't confined to a single religious tradition.
No.
But they're fundamental to human connection and well-being. What about letting go of the ego and finding that inner peace?
Yeah, that's another big one. The chapter points to Luke 9.23 in Christianity, the Buddhist Noble Eightfold Path.
Okay.
Which includes things like detachment and understanding to overcome suffering, Surah Ashura 42.51 in Islam, which talks about God communicating with humanity beyond the egoic self.
Right.
And the Bhagavad Gita 2.47, which teaches acting without attachment to the results of our actions.
It's that theme of finding liberation and inner peace through some form of self-transcendence.
Right, moving beyond the ego.
What about selflessness in serving the world?
For this, we see Mark 9.35 and Galatians 5.13 in Christianity, the Buddhist teachings in the Dhammapada that emphasize compassion and selfless action.
Okay.
Surah Al-Mumtahana 60.8 in Islam, which encourages kindness and justice, even towards those who don't share your faith. And the Bhagavad Gita 3.19, which stresses the importance of acting selflessly.
So that idea of selfless service as this core ethical principle.
Yeah, a powerful and universal concept.
What about living according to a higher purpose or divine will?
That's connected to Matthew 7.24 and Psalm 119.105 in Christianity, the Buddhist teachings in the Dhammapada on following the path of righteousness. Surah Al-Ahzab 33.21 in Islam, which presents Prophet Muhammad as a model for living in accordance with God's will, and the Bhagavad Gita 18.66, which is all about surrender to the divine will.
So aligning one's life with, divine guidance.
Yeah, finding that sense of purpose and meaning.
And the chapter even includes, these real-world application examples for all of these parallel teachings,
Right.
encouraging us to think about how these principles could show up in our own lives.
Yeah, no matter our background or beliefs.
It's really fascinating to see these echoes across such diverse traditions.
It is.
It really seems like these principles, humility, love, selflessness, they might tap into something very universal in the human experience.
Yeah, some shared human wisdom about living well.
Well, this has been an incredibly insightful deep dive into this Misfortune of Ego chapter and the renewal framework.
It's remarkable how this Christian perspective on the Tao Te Ching really illuminates the way these things are all connected.
Yeah.
Our mindset, our aims, our practices, and how we respond to the world.
Yeah.
All in this journey of overcoming ego and cultivating humility and love.
And the chapter really drives home that point that this misfortune of ego, it's not just some abstract philosophical idea. It's a real and powerful obstacle to living this more fulfilling and connected life. And it really does offer this, tangible path forward through conscious effort, selfless action, and aligning our lives with a higher purpose.
A message that resonates not just within Christianity, but as we've seen within other spiritual traditions as well.
It really gives you a lot to think about, doesn't it?
It does.
In the quiet moments of your day, can you become more aware of the subtle ways your ego might be influencing your thoughts, your feelings, your actions? Perhaps just recognizing those moments is the key to starting to cultivate genuine humility and a deeper sense of connection, both with the people around you and with something much larger than yourself.
That's a powerful thought to leave with.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.